What if the story of humanity you've been told was only half the truth? What if there existed an archaeological piece capable of rewriting everything we believe about our origins, but which is being deliberately ignored? A recent discovery has left archaeologists silent and scholars uneasy. A 12,000-year-old statue depicting a black god was found in a remote location, shrouded in ancient symbolism, with details that defy the official chronology of civilization. And most strikingly, no one is talking about it. Why is such a shocking discovery being swept under the rug of history? Who is deciding what deserves to be revealed to the public and what doesn't? There's something much bigger behind this silent relic, and today you'll begin to understand why. This isn't just another ancient sculpture. This is concrete, real, tangible evidence that advanced cultures existed long before history books dare admit. An ancient civilization, rich in spirituality, wisdom, and connection with the divine, venerated this black god. His presence challenged Eurocentric narratives, shook the foundations of traditional archaeology, and revealed a black protagonism that had always existed, but had been systematically erased. The fact that this statue has been hidden from the mainstream media, major academic centers, and even religious circles is no coincidence. It's part of a well-designed project to keep certain mysteries buried. But why does this statue bother so much? What is so powerful about it that it needs to be silenced? Could it be the representation of a forgotten African god? Or perhaps a spiritual being whose identity has been diluted over time, transformed, erased, and replaced by more acceptable images throughout history? What prevents us from accepting that black people have been spiritual, cultural, and technological protagonists since the beginning of the earth? Perhaps what lies behind this discovery is more than archaeology. Perhaps it is a spiritual call to reconnect with a deeper, truer origin. Over the next few minutes, we'll delve into one of the most overlooked and yet most transformative topics of recent times. We'll discuss ancient black civilizations that not only existed but flourished even before writing, even before the pyramids. We'll analyze what this statue represents, which god is depicted on it, and why it was hidden. We'll connect the dots with little-discussed biblical texts, forgotten prophecies, erased figures from spirituality, and codes that reveal that this story is just beginning to emerge. You'll understand how ancestral spirituality was distorted, how ancient symbols were reinterpreted, and how this statue represents more than just an archaeological piece. It represents a silent cry for historical justice, spiritual truth, and a reconnection with humanity's divine roots. The silence surrounding it is the greatest sign that we are facing something powerful. And now, you're about to discover what they don't want you to know. Prepare to explore a journey that goes from the depths of history to the very core of your soul. Because what you'll see in this video will completely change the way you see God, history, and perhaps even yourself. Now, before I reveal to you exactly what this statue represents and why it's being hidden, we need to go back in time, long before the Bible, long before organized religions, to understand who these people were and why their spirituality was erased from the official narrative. And that's why every detail of this discovery cannot be ignored. Now that you've begun to see what's behind this silence, I want to know, what do you think? Do you believe this statue represents something that was purposefully hidden? Or do you think we're just beginning to unravel a story much larger than we imagine? Leave your opinion in the comments. I read everything, and your voice is part of this investigation. If this content resonated with you, if it provoked reflection, or provided a new perspective on humanity's spiritual history, don't leave without leaving a like. This helps the video reach more people who, like you, are also searching for truth. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take this opportunity to subscribe and activate the bell, because in future videos we'll delve even deeper into this mystery and reveal connections that will challenge everything we've been taught to date. This is just the beginning, and to understand why this statue was completely silenced by the mainstream media, we must begin with its discovery, a discovery as enigmatic as it is powerful. The site where it was found is no ordinary place. It's an isolated desert region, far from major urban centers, where major excavations are rarely conducted, an area that, until recently, was considered archaeologically unproductive, and perhaps that's why it became the perfect hiding place to keep certain records hidden from the eyes of the world. But fate, or perhaps a greater force, decided to reveal this secret. It all began when a group of independent researchers, motivated by ancient accounts from local tribes, decided to map a little explored area of the African Sahel. These accounts spoke of an ancient figure made of black stone, with eyes like burning coals and a countenance of divine power. During the excavations, instruments began detecting unusual resonance patterns underground. At first, they thought it was a common rock formation. But as they delved deeper, they found fragments of sculpture with never-before-seen symbolic markings, belonging to no officially catalogued culture. As the days passed, more parts of the figure surfaced, until, before their eyes, its complete form emerged. A perfectly carved statue with distinctly African features, covered in archaic inscriptions, and radiating an energy that even the most skeptical described as spiritual. It was an imposing figure. His face was strong, broad, with undeniably dark features, a braided beard, and his eyes turned upward, as if contemplating the invisible. Around his body were carved circular symbols, spiral lines, serpentine shapes, and what appears to be a solar disk on his back. Details that for experts in ancient cultures allude to cosmic rituals, astral beliefs, and connections between heaven and earth. The sculpture was then carefully removed, catalogued, and transported by these researchers. But since then, silence has descended. No major university has published anything. No international museum has requested access. No media outlet has reported on it. Absolutely nothing. And that's precisely where the question becomes inevitable. Why isn't the media talking about this? Why is a discovery that, in theory, could be celebrated as one of the oldest religious representations ever found, still ignored by major institutions? What are they trying to protect or hide? The answer may lie in the statue itself, because this is not just an artistic representation. It carries within itself the power to destabilize everything that has been established as historical truth. It shows that before white empires, before Western religions dominated the world, there did exist a deeply developed black spirituality. And not only that, a spirituality revered, connected to the cosmos, and recognized as sacred. Imagine the impact of assuming that an African civilization possessed symbols as advanced as the Egyptians, as mystical as the Sumerians, and as sacred as the Hebrews. This shatters the myth of European centrality in spirituality and ancient knowledge. It directly challenges the way we've been taught to view the Bible, the prophets, and even God himself. The image of a black god sculpted 12,000 years ago doesn't fit the Western, white, and standardized mold of modern religions. Therefore, this statue not only disturbs, it threatens. We are experiencing an extremely difficult era in which the prophecies are being scored, but many still do not realize what is happening in the world. This is why I made my digital book available, To Reveal the Apocalypse, which you can download immediately through the first comment set. This book will help you discover all the mysteries of the apocalypse and transform your life. Access the first comment set to get your copy, because very few remain and will soon be withdrawn. Don't waste time. Click now and make sure your digital copy. Researchers involved in the discovery reported difficulties soon after the initial announcement among their peers. Universities denied support for in-depth studies. Institutions refused to fund the analysis of the symbols. Emails went unanswered. The discovery began to be treated as unofficial. There were even attempts to discredit the team, accusing them of fanciful interpretation. But what they could not erase was the photographic record, the excavation data, and, most importantly, the spiritual impact this statue had on those who stood before it. The energy felt by many there was described as ancestral, divine, intense, and by some, as a calling. And that's why the silence surrounding this discovery is so deafening. When history is uncomfortable, it's stifled. When truth confronts the system, it's silenced. And when a dark divine image emerges from the past, it's not celebrated, it's hidden. And don't forget to get your digital book, Reveal the Apocalypse. It is very important that you buy it quickly before the copies run out. But most curious of all, and perhaps most disturbing, is that this discovery parallels ancient African accounts of a celestial god who descended among them in times of darkness and taught the way of light, a being described as black, shrouded in a golden glow, with eyes that saw beyond time. Could this statue be a representation of this same being? Could we be standing before an ancient deity worshipped millennia before the first lines of the Bible were written? This is where we begin to understand why the spiritual, political, and academic elite are so fearful of this issue coming to light. Because if this divine image predates official religious records, then it completely changes humanity's spiritual timeline. And if this deity is black, then it also changes the way the world has been taught to view the sacred. We're talking about a complete deconstruction of narratives, dogmas, and power structures. This statue isn't just archaeology, it's a threat to the status quo. It forces humanity to recognize that there was indeed a black spiritual protagonism prior to the dominant narratives. It demands a rethinking of how we teach history in schools, how we preach from pulpits, and how we view ourselves before God. And that's why this video needs to exist. Because while they hide, we reveal. While they remain silent, we speak. And while many ignore this truth, you are here, awakening. So tell me, how did you feel when you learned all this? Did this discovery make you think differently? Had you ever heard of an ancient black god before? I want you to comment below with the phrase, "The truth is emerging," if you believe we're just beginning to see what has been erased for centuries. And take the opportunity to tell me, do you think this statue should be all over the news? Or was it hidden for deeper spiritual reasons? Your comment is part of this investigation. Like the video if it resonated with you and share it with someone who needs their eyes opened. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. Activate the bell, because in the next chapter we'll delve even deeper into what this figure represents and how it connects to black civilizations that existed even before Egypt built its pyramids. And when we look at this 12,000-year-old statue with attentive eyes, something begins to shift within us. It's not just an image carved in stone. It's as if it were alive, as if time hadn't erased its essence. And this is where the most important question arises. Who was this black god? What kind of powerful entity is this, that an ancient civilization decided to immortalize in stone, with cosmic symbols surrounding it and an expression of indisputable spiritual authority? We're not talking about just any figure. This deity is not a modern invention. Its form carries traces of wisdom, power, ancestry, and a connection to forces that defy traditional historical logic. This figure represents much more than just an ancient god. It represents a force that predates the very concept of religion as we know it. It points to a time when spirituality and life were deeply intertwined, when the divine walked among humanity, and humanity recognized the sacred in its purest form, without dogma, without imposed hierarchies, without manipulation. The image of the black god is not merely symbolic. It is a reminder that the roots of spirituality are much deeper, much older, and much more diverse than what was built by the empires and institutions that came after. Many independent scholars, outside of traditional circles, have hypothesized that this entity may be related to a primordial deity present in various ancient African mythologies. In many traditions, especially in West African cultures, there is the figure of a supreme creator, dark-skinned, enveloped in light, responsible for shaping the universe and giving rise to humanity. He is seen not as a distant and impersonal being, but as a living spirit that manifests itself in nature, the elements, time, and the soul of each human being. This description is eerily consistent with the features depicted in the statue: the upward-looking eyes, the connection with the stars, the solar disk, the serpentine elements, all pointing to a cosmic deity, deeply connected to the cycle of creation. But why was this god forgotten? Or rather, why did they insist on erasing him from official history? The answer begins to reveal itself when we compare this type of deity with Western representations of God, especially those propagated during the colonial period. The modern religious system needed an image of authority that would legitimize European rule. And what could be more effective than a white god with European features, enthroned in cathedrals, depicted in paintings, and imposed as the only truth? In this context, a black creator and cosmic god was simply unacceptable. He needed to be removed from the narrative, relegated to the realm of pagan, wrong, and idolatrous. The ancestral spiritual connection that African peoples had with this entity came to be considered heresy, witchcraft, and sin. Entire tribes were forced to abandon their rituals. Texts were burned. Oral traditions were silenced, all to ensure that this deity would disappear. But he didn't, because the spirit is not extinguished by colonization. It hides, protects itself, and waits for the right moment to emerge again. And perhaps, just perhaps, that moment has arrived with the emergence of this statue. Not as an archaeological accident, but as a prophetic sign that the time of truth is returning. This deity, whom we will call here the Forgotten God, carries within itself the memory of a people, the wisdom of a continent, and the power to rescue all that was lost. Now, something even more intriguing happens when we begin to compare the symbols of this statue with elements of Sumerian mythology. Despite the geographical distance between African and Mesopotamian cultures, there are recurring patterns. For example, the use of the serpent as a representation of eternal knowledge and spiritual strength, the solar disk as an emblem of creation and divine light, and the position of the statue's hands, similar to figures found on ancient Sumerian cylinders, which represent gods holding the instruments of life. This cannot be a coincidence. There is a spiritual thread connecting these civilizations, a sacred heritage that has been passed down from generation to generation, even under oppression and attempted erasure. Some bolder scholars even suggest that this dark deity was the primary basis for the divine figures that later emerged in Mesopotamian and Egyptian cultures. In other words, before Enki, before Ra, even before El Shaddai, this ancient force, this dark divine consciousness, existed, revered by peoples who saw the universe as a living, pulsating body, full of purpose and mystery. And when we think about this, the spiritual impact becomes even greater. Because if this divinity is indeed the origin, then it doesn't belong to just one people. It is the root of humanity. It is the missing link between the divine and the human. It is the image of God that was denied, hidden, replaced. But now it begins to reappear. The most powerful thing of all is realizing that this image still pulses within us. It lives in our genetic memory, in our intuition, in the inner calling that so many people have been feeling lately. A spiritual restlessness, a hunger for truth, a desire to return to our roots. Perhaps you, watching this video, are feeling exactly that right now. As if something inside you is saying, I already knew this, even without having seen it before. This is the effect of coming into contact with a divinity that carries the memory of our spirit. Not an institutionalized figure, shaped by doctrines, but a living archetype, a reflection of the divine within us. A black god, yes, but above all, a human god, close to us, eternal. And so I invite you to comment below with the phrase, "The forgotten image is awakening," if you feel this entity is not a creation, but rather a memory. Also, tell me, have you ever heard of African gods that predate Egypt? Have you ever wondered why this story never reached you in school or religious sermons? Your comment is more than an opinion. It is part of a recovery. Like this video if something touched your heart. Share it with anyone who needs a reminder of where it came from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do so now. Because in the next episode, we'll delve even deeper into the origins of these civilizations that venerated this entity, and discover why its legacy was completely erased from history as we know it. And when we delve into this search for the origins of the black god represented in the statue, we are inevitably led to look beyond the boundaries of what we know as official history. And this is where we begin to enter a territory many avoid, that of pre-biblical black civilizations. That's right. Before Egypt built its pyramids, before the kings of Canaan were mentioned in scripture, before Mesopotamia was called the cradle of civilization, there were already organized, advanced, spiritual black peoples deeply connected to the divine. But these civilizations were erased from the global narrative, not because they left no trace, but because their traces were of no interest to those who built the system of power we know today. But the truth lies in the stones, and stones speak, even if they try to silence them. In the vast region of Central and Sub-Saharan Africa, archaeological records point to structured societies with mastery of engineering, metallurgy, astronomy, and complex spirituality, dating back tens of thousands of years before any biblical or Sumerian mention. We are talking about centers of knowledge that not only existed but influenced other cultures and were responsible for generating knowledge that would later be reused and renamed by later empires. One of these kingdoms, for example, is known today by archaeologists as Nabta Playa. Located in southern Egypt, almost on the border with Sudan, this archaeological site boasts ancient astronomical alignments, far older than Stonehenge or the pyramids of Giza. The stones arranged there precisely mark solstices, equinoxes, and lunar cycles, demonstrating that these peoples understood the heavens with a mastery that defies even modern standards. Now think with me. Who taught them this? Or rather, where did this wisdom come from? Which, in theory, should only have appeared thousands of years later. And if this civilization was capable of creating monuments based on celestial movements, do you really think it didn't have its own spirituality, its own divinity, its own rituals of connection with the sacred? This 12,000-year-old statue may have been part of a cosmic cult, a physical representation of the entity that ruled the heavens and the earth, a bridge between the visible and the invisible, the image of a black, strong, celestial god, as guardian of the stars and father of creation. Another example worth mentioning is the Nok culture in Nigeria, which flourished thousands of years before Christ and produced sculptures with impressive features, sophisticated artistic expression, and once again, profound spiritual characteristics. Serene faces, large eyes, carefully carved symbols, all indicating that there was more than art involved. There was faith, there was devotion, there was a story being told by ancestral hands. The statue we are investigating may have a direct connection to this type of cultural lineage. It may be part of a spiritual chain that not only preceded but also influenced later cultures. The question few have the courage to raise is, why aren't these records taught in schools? Why don't ancient black civilizations occupy the same chapters in history books as the Greeks, Romans, or Sumerians? The answer is simple and uncomfortable. Because if we recognize that there were organized, sacred, prosperous, and wise black civilizations before so-called written history, then the entire discourse of colonial superiority would collapse. And along with it, the constructed image of an exclusively European, white god, distant from Africa and blackness, would also collapse. But true archaeology doesn't lie. There is evidence of structured cities, irrigation systems, sophisticated architectural and mining techniques spread throughout the African continent. The Empire of Kush, for example, already rivaled Egypt in wisdom and power. And speaking of Egypt, few know this, but the first pharaohs had dark skin. Their features were distinctly African. Their spiritual practices were deeply rooted in southern knowledge. The connection between Egypt and more ancient civilizations in the interior of Africa is undeniable. And all of this reinforces the idea that black spirituality is the matrix, the origin, the beginning of everything. The 12,000-year-old statue may very well be the missing link between these civilizations, the missing piece that validates what for centuries was considered myth, superstition, or simply ignored. Perhaps it represents humanity's first structured concept of divinity. And if so, then the image of God as a strong, spiritual, and creative black being is not an invention. It is a recovery, a return to origins, a rediscovery of truth. Many of the symbols that appear around the statue have also been found in caves and rock formations in Mali, Ethiopia, and even southern Africa. Intertwined serpents, solar eyes, figures with open arms. All of this repeats itself like a spiritual echo from the past, as if all these civilizations had connected to the same source. A God who spoke to them all, who manifested himself in different ways, but always with the same signs. This cannot be a coincidence. This is a profound, universal spiritual pattern, a pattern that was erased so that another could be imposed. And now that we've begun to connect the dots, there's no turning back. This revelation invites us to rethink everything, who we were, who we are, and what we believe. Spirituality didn't begin with Rome, nor with Jerusalem. It began much earlier, in the heart of Africa, among people who danced with the elements, read the stars, spoke with their ancestors, and carved their gods in stone, not to worship them as dead statues, but to remember where we came from. This statue is more than an artifact. It's a mirror of humanity's ancestral soul, an invitation to return to our origins, a silent call to awaken the spiritual memory that lies dormant within each of us. And that's why I want to hear from you now. Did this content resonate with you? Do you feel like we're, together, touching on truths that have been buried for millennia? If so, comment below with the phrase, "Ancestral wisdom is returning." This will show me that your heart is open to what's yet to come. And if you'd like to reinforce this journey, please also leave the name of an ancient African civilization you've heard of or want to learn more about. And as all this evidence connects before our eyes, one question echoes with increasing force. Why was this history erased? What could have led entire institutions, religious, political, and academic, to wipe from collective memory not only the existence of these black spiritual civilizations, but especially the reverence for the ancestral black god? The answer is painful but necessary. It was erased because it represents a threat. A direct threat to everything built around a centralized, Eurocentric, exclusionary, and manipulated narrative. And when a spiritual truth threatens the ideological control of empires and organized religious systems, it is buried. Colonization wasn't just physical or territorial. It was, above all, symbolic. When European colonizers arrived in Africa, they encountered people with rich cultures, organized social structures, and deeply rooted ancient spiritual systems. These peoples weren't savages, as schoolbooks still insist on teaching. They possessed ancestral wisdom, a connection with nature, astronomical calendars, traditional medicine, spiritual codes, and their own gods. And not just any gods. We're talking about strong, cosmic black deities linked to creation, the fertility of the earth, the wisdom of the stars, justice, and the cycle of life. Now imagine the shock. Europeans, faced with all this, realized that to dominate, they would need not only to impose their weapons, but also their beliefs. Because it's easier to dominate someone who has lost their roots. It's easier to enslave a people who don't remember who they are. And that's why colonial systems sought to erase, burn, ridicule, and demonize everything that evoked original black spirituality. Black gods were transformed into demons. Sacred rituals were labeled witchcraft, and ancient spiritual traditions came to be seen as ignorance or idolatry. It was then that a meticulous process of historical revision began, a complete reprogramming of humanity's spiritual memory. Europeans began rewriting the facts, positioning their own interpretations as absolute truths, and shifting the origins of spirituality to places that strengthened their power. Egypt, originally part of Black Africa, was slowly whitewashed in books and iconography. The figures of Moses, Abraham, and even Jesus began to be depicted with European features. Everything was carefully redesigned so that the sacred would have a familiar face to the oppressive system, and those who dared question this narrative were silenced. Many researchers who attempted to demonstrate the black origins of ancient deities had their work discredited. Relics were locked away in museum basements. Sacred texts from African oral traditions were never officially recorded. The academic elite created filters for what would be considered valid knowledge, and anything that hinted at black spiritual protagonism was labeled a myth, legend, or popular invention. But the erasure wasn't just intellectual. It was also psychological and spiritual. For centuries, black people were taught to distance themselves from their roots, to reject their ancestry, to see their own spirituality as something inferior, dirty, or shameful. And perhaps this was the cruelest blow of all, because when a people forget who they are spiritually, they become more vulnerable to manipulation. They lose their inner strength. They stop seeing God in their own image and begin to seek Him only in the image their oppressor offered. The 12,000-year-old statue we are analyzing here represents exactly the opposite of this. It is a physical and symbolic reminder that there was a time when the black god was revered, when he was not a marginal figure, but the center of the spirituality of wise peoples. This statue in itself is an act of resistance, a monument to the spiritual memory that they tried to erase, but which survived. It proves that black spirituality is not a modern invention. It comes from afar. It is foundational. It is rooted. And when we look at this reality with open eyes, we begin to realize that the omission of this history was not accidental. It was strategic. Because if people today discover that ancient African peoples already worshipped a creator god before Christianity even existed, this undermines the argument that faith only reached Africa through colonizers. What's more, if this god was black, strong, wise, and cosmic, this completely changes the way spirituality is perceived globally. That's why you didn't learn this story in school. That's why it's not talked about in traditional churches. That's why this statue was discovered and immediately relegated to the sidelines, as if it didn't matter. But it does, because it represents everything the system tries to hide: the spiritual truth of origin, the ancestral power that doesn't bow, the image of God reflected in melanin and curly hair, in the sacred traditions of a people who resisted. There are profound theories that explain this erasure as part of a systematic plan for global domination. Some of these theories argue that the erasure of the image of the black god is part of an effort to maintain spiritual control over the masses, preventing people from connecting with a deeper, freer, more personal truth. Others discuss the importance of spiritual identity in building a people's self-esteem, and how this self-esteem is key to resistance and liberation. The truth is that, regardless of the theory, the result has always been the same: an imposed spiritual vacuum. And this vacuum is now being filled as these revelations begin to emerge. And perhaps if you've made it this far in this video, it's because this truth has already begun knocking on the door of your spirit. Perhaps you too feel that something needs to be rescued, that there's a bond that was broken and needs to be restored. This statue isn't just an ancient sculpture. It's a symbol of reconnection. It calls us to a spiritual return that transcends religions, dogmas, and manipulated versions of history. So, tell me in the comments, have you ever suspected that humanity's spiritual history has been manipulated? Have you ever felt that the image of God presented to you was incomplete? If so, comment below with the phrase, "They're trying to hide who we are." This helps keep this video alive and brings this message to more people who, like you, are awakening to something greater. Like this video if it touched you in any way. Share it with someone who needs to remember their origins. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because in the next episode, we'll delve into the evidence, both physical and spiritual, that proves this erasure was orchestrated, but that the truth is resurfacing. And you'll understand why this statue, silent and forgotten for millennia, holds within it the key to the greatest spiritual rescue of our generation. And if everything we're unearthing, literally, seems far from the biblical narrative most of us were taught, it's because we were taught a partial Bible, a selective Bible. A Bible that, despite being incredibly rich in historical, symbolic, and spiritual detail, was read, interpreted, and taught through the lens of those interested in keeping certain characters, certain peoples, and certain signs invisible. But the truth is that the Bible is full of connections to black people, to African spiritual figures, and to regions like Ethiopia, Cush, and Sheba, names that appear repeatedly in Scripture, but that curiously have been left out, minimized, or treated as irrelevant. What no one talks about or avoids talking about is that the African presence in the Bible is intense, profound, and often central. And this, in itself, points to something that has been hidden from us: the role of black people in the sacred history of humanity. When we talk about Ethiopia, for example, we are not talking about a peripheral place. We are talking about an ancient nation that existed, organized, and with sovereignty long before Israel was established. A people known not only for their wealth and wisdom, but also for their spirituality. And what's most impressive is that these people are mentioned several times in Scripture. In Genesis 2, for example, the region of Cush is described as part of Eden, the very garden of creation. This alone should change the way we view the origins of humanity. If Cush, an African territory, is directly linked to Eden, could God's original plan have already been manifested on African soil long before religions as we know them emerged? This changes everything. Later in the book of Numbers, we meet Zipporah, Moses' wife, who is identified as a Cushite woman, that is, a black African woman. It's shocking to think that the man chosen by God to liberate the people of Israel was married to a black woman. And even more shocking is the discomfort this caused even among his own people, as shown in the episode in which Miriam and Aaron murmur against Moses because of his Cushite wife being immediately rebuked by God. This biblical detail shows that the racial issue was already present, but God's position was clear. God's choice does not follow human criteria. And then we have Sheba, the famous queen who visits King Solomon, bringing treasures, profound questions, and a testimony of wisdom that surprises even the wisest man on earth. The Queen of Sheba, according to records, came from a land to the south, possibly present-day Ethiopia or Yemen, and her figure is revered to this day in Ethiopian traditions as the ancestor of a sacred royal lineage. If this is true, we are faced with a cross between African blood and the blood of David, the same messianic lineage as Jesus. But have you ever heard this possibility discussed from the pulpit of your church? Probably not. Because acknowledging this intertwining radically changes the narrative of salvation. It changes the color of origins. It changes the place of spiritual protagonism. Now, if we return to the 12,000-year-old statue and place this information side by side, the puzzle begins to come together. The statue's pose, the eyes turned to the sky, the symbols surrounding the body, the serpent, the solar disk, the unmistakable features of a dark deity. Everything points to a cosmic spirituality that existed before the biblical text was written, but was absorbed in part by the prophets and authors who composed the scriptures. And that is why these traces are still there, hidden between verses, waiting to be seen by more attentive eyes. When Isaiah, in chapter 18, speaks of a dark-skinned people living beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, many scholars ignore this text, but it is there. A people described as strong, fearless, and with a mysterious role in divine plans. The prophet Zephaniah, in turn, mentions the conversion of the sons of Cush in the days of judgment, a direct reference to a spiritual reconnection of black people with God in the end times. These passages are not random. They are part of a web of revelations that has been overlooked for centuries, but is now beginning to emerge with greater force. There is also the enigmatic figure of the Ethiopian eunuch, who appears in the book of Acts of the Apostles. He was reading Isaiah, thirsting to understand the mystery of the Messiah, and was baptized by Philip after a direct revelation from the Spirit. This shows that from the earliest moments of the expansion of Christianity, Africans were already actively seeking spiritual truth and being reached by it. So tell me, how can we justify the absence of this narrative in sermons? How can we explain the silence about these characters when the Bible itself places them as important pieces in the puzzle of faith? The truth is, the elements are all there. It's just that many have been trained not to see them, trained to focus on European names, Middle Eastern cities, and images created during the Middle Ages, and to ignore the details that point to a black spiritual ancestry. What we're doing here, in this video, is rediscovering that lost thread. And perhaps, just perhaps, this statue is the clearest sign that the Bible doesn't just allow for these connections, it confirms them. Because if Cush was in Eden, and if Sheba spoke with Solomon, and if the Spirit of God touched the heart of an African in the desert, then everything that was constructed to distance black people from their original spirituality needs to be deconstructed. And that begins with information, with reflection, with the courage to look at the Bible with new eyes, eyes that are not afraid of the truth. Because the truth, when revealed, does not divide, it liberates. And if you're here, listening to this so far, perhaps your spirit is already feeling this liberation. Perhaps a new consciousness is being activated within you, one that recognizes that your color, your origin, your story is also written in the sacred pages, and that this redemption is not just cultural, it's spiritual, it's prophetic. So comment below with the phrase, "I see myself in the scriptures," if you believe these passages need to be discussed, studied, and shared more. If any of these biblical connections surprised you today, leave a comment with the one that resonated most with you. Your comment is part of this collective awakening. If you haven't liked this video yet, now is the time. This helps spread this content and rescue others who are also searching for answers. Share it with someone who needs to see the Bible with new eyes. And of course, if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take advantage and subscribe now. Because in the next episode, we'll continue our journey, revealing hidden evidence, historical and spiritual connections that will make you see what you've never been told about the figures hidden behind the sacred texts. And after understanding how the Bible holds clear traces of a black spiritual ancestry that was ignored for centuries, it's inevitable that we want more than textual connections. We want proof, physical evidence, concrete signs that this ancient African spirituality isn't just an alternative interpretation or a curious theory, but a truth backed by data, studies, and discoveries. And that's exactly what we have, because the 12,000-year-old statue isn't alone in this story. Surrounding it are countless marks, symbols, records, and scientific confirmations that simply can no longer be ignored. When the first fragments of this statue were recovered from underground, one of the researchers' concerns was proving its antiquity. After all, any artifact that challenges the official historical narrative faces resistance. Therefore, it was immediately subjected to carbon-14 dating tests, the most reliable method currently used to determine the age of organic materials, and remains linked to the archaeological context in which the object was found. The results were as striking as the sculpture itself. It is estimated that this figure was created approximately 12,000 years ago. In other words, at a time when, according to the dominant narrative, humans were just beginning to live a sedentary lifestyle, still far from any complex religious or symbolic structure. But then how can one explain a statue with such rich detail, sculpted with exquisite technique, adorned with clearly spiritual elements, and surrounded by inscriptions that defy known languages? It's not just an ancient artifact. It's a piece that demands a complete rethinking of civilization's timeline, a rethinking many refuse to undertake, precisely because it gives prominence to peoples who have been systematically erased from history. In addition to carbon dating, which validated the site's antiquity, sculpting tools were also found near the statue. Rudimentary but strategically sharpened instruments, shaped from volcanic rock, which still bear mineral residues consistent with the statue's surface. This shows that it wasn't brought from elsewhere. It was made right there, in the heart of an African land, by hands that knew what they were doing, and that, clearly, they were creating something sacred. Around the sculpture, arranged in nearly concentric circles, more than 40 symbols were identified, engraved on smaller stones, which appear to have been placed there intentionally. These symbols range from spirals, stylized human figures, mythical animals, and geometric shapes linked to the movement of the sun and moon. Independent researchers, when comparing these inscriptions with symbols from other ancient cultures, noticed something intriguing. Many of them bear striking resemblance to icons found in South African caves, Saharan rock art, proto-written inscriptions from Nile cultures, and even early Sumerian fragments. What does this mean? That these ancient cultures shared a common symbolic vocabulary, or in other words, that there was a universal spiritual language being expressed by these peoples, even before any formal writing system, a language of symbols, images, and energy imprinted in stone. And when similar symbols appear in such distant places, it indicates exchange, or influence, or even a common origin that spread before cultural boundaries were established. One of the most frequently repeated symbols at this site is the double spiral, often associated with rebirth, DNA, and life force. It frequently appears around the statue's head, as if indicating a spiritual energy field. Another recurring symbol is the eye, but not the ordinary human eye. It's an oval eye with vertical lines and a solar outline, a type of representation that was later absorbed by Egyptian cultures, but which appears here millennia earlier. This calls into question everything we've been told about who influenced whom. Because if this symbol appears first in this 12,000-year-old statue, and only later in other civilizations, then it's quite likely that the cradle of symbolic and spiritual knowledge lies in ancient Black Africa. And it doesn't stop there. Traces of natural pigments were also found around the statue, indicating that it may have been originally painted. Laboratory tests revealed traces of iron oxide, a reddish pigment, and charcoal, which produces dark, dense tones. These elements were commonly used in rituals, body painting, and ceremonial art in ancient African cultures. This suggests that the statue was not merely a passive symbol, but part of an active spiritual practice, perhaps a kind of cosmic cult, a veneration of the divine through the image, a living altar, like a conduit between humans and the sacred. And all this evidence, was ignored by the mainstream media, by traditional universities, by theological circles. Why? Because it doesn't fit, because it's disorganizing, because it shows that there was wisdom, technology, spirituality, and black science in a time when many still call us primitive. But those with eyes to see realize the truth is written in stone, and these stones don't lie. Imagine the global impact if everyone knew that before any Western empire existed, African peoples were already erecting divine sculptures, leaving cosmic symbols, and creating centers of profound spirituality connected to the universe. This isn't just a historical revision, it's a spiritual revolution. It's a reconnection with the roots that were torn from us, and this statue is a clear sign that the time of oblivion is ending. So, I want to ask you now, what strikes you most about this evidence? Have you ever heard of carbon-14 dating applied to African discoveries? Did you know that pre-written symbols existed in regions of Africa long before Mesopotamia? Tell me in the comments. And if you've come this far, with an open heart, comment with the phrase, "The stones still speak," so I know you're part of this awakening. And as we delve deeper into this sea of buried truths, a light begins to shine on a point that is rarely discussed seriously: the connection between ancient African cults and what would later become the spiritual foundation of various religions around the world. And here, we're not talking about coincidences. We're talking about roots, spiritual origins that, however distorted, manipulated, or disguised over the centuries, continue to pulse beneath formal doctrines, like a foundation that has never truly been erased. The 12,000-year-old statue, with its unmistakably African features, represents much more than a forgotten deity. It is a physical reminder that, before organized religions, there existed profound spiritual cults, connected to nature, the cosmos, and ancestry. And these cults had a center, a focus, a higher entity that governed life. This being, in many ancient African cultures, was known as the unknown god, a name given not out of lack of knowledge but out of reverence. The creator's name is not pronounced because he is beyond any human definition. In the traditions of the peoples of West Africa, for example, we find the concept of a supreme creative force, often called Olodumare among the Yoruba, Nzambi in regions of Central Africa, Ma'awu among the Akan peoples. All these denominations point to the same archetype, a creator god, invisible, unattainable, yet present in all things. And this god was not only feared, he was revered, invoked, danced to, and celebrated in the cycles of nature. His messengers, the Orishas, the spirits, the ancestors, were bridges between the divine plane and the earth. Now observe how this model spread. Note the similarities between these African cults and spiritual rituals from other parts of the world. In Hinduism, we have Brahman, the absolute being that cannot be described. In Taoism, we have the Tao, which cannot be named. In the Old Testament, we find the expression, "I am that I am," when God answers Moses, showing that even in the Hebrew tradition, there was this notion of an entity that is beyond names. All of this points to the same spiritual pattern, reverence for the supreme God who is not limited by form, a God unknown, yet intensely present. And if we look closely, ancient African cults are incredibly rich in elements that reappear, in different guises, in other religions around the globe. The use of symbols, such as circles, spirals, eyes, and solar discs. The repetition of chants, mantras, and sacred words that vibrate the energy of the divine. Spiritual embodiment, where the spirit manifests itself through the body. Symbolic sacrifices, rites of passage and rebirth, festivals that follow the lunar and solar cycles. All of this existed and continues to exist in ancestral African traditions. Many contemporary scholars, outside the traditional academic circle, are beginning to admit that what we call primitive religions were in fact highly advanced spiritual systems, with a profound understanding of human beings, the universe, and the relationship between the visible and invisible dimensions. But these systems were dismissed because they were not accompanied by marble temples or texts written on golden scrolls. They came from the earth, from drums, from smoke, from dance, from orality, from wisdom passed down from grandmother to grandchild. And that is precisely what made them dangerous to the system. They were too spiritual to be controlled. The worship of the unknown God in African cultures was not a denial of God, as many have been led to believe. It was a recognition of his greatness, a God who manifests himself in rain, thunder, birth, death, dance, and the germinating seed. A God who is not confined to stone temples, but walks among men. And now think with me, isn't this exactly what the scriptures also say? That the Spirit blows where he wills? That the kingdom of God is within us? That he dwells in living temples, not made by human hands? This makes us realize that perhaps modern religions haven't created new spiritual ideas. They've merely reorganized what already existed since ancient times. And if the foundations of these ideas come from African traditions, then why haven't we been told about this? Why haven't we been told that the concept of a universal, creator, and omnipresent God was already being worshipped in Africa before Moses was even born? The most shocking thing is realizing that despite all the erasure, this spirituality has not disappeared. It has survived. It has camouflaged itself in the Afro-descendant cults of the Americas, in the toreros, in the praise festivals, in the songs that mix ancient languages with Portuguese. It has been demonized, but never destroyed. Because true spirituality does not need human approval, it continues to exist even in silence. And today, with this statue before us, with all its sacred symbols, with its unwavering presence, we feel that this spirituality wants to speak again. It wants to rise up. That's why so many are drawn to this theme, even without understanding exactly why. It's the ancestral spirit calling, the spiritual memory trying to reconnect with that which was interrupted. And this connection doesn't just happen in the mind. It happens in the body, the heart, the soul. It's a memory that comes from within, that warms, that pulsates. Do you feel this too? If so, then I want you to comment below with the phrase, "The unknown God calls me." Write this if you felt something in this video that moved you in a way that goes beyond reason. Also, tell me if you've ever participated in a spiritual ritual that made you feel something greater than words can explain. Your story can inspire others to remember that there's more between heaven and earth than institutionalized religion allows us to see. And as we delve deeper into this story that can no longer be called coincidence, we encounter a burning question. Why is this discovery so disturbing? Why is a 12,000-year-old statue representing a black god treated with such silence, such discomfort, such attempts at oblivion? The answer may seem simple, but it carries immense weight, because it breaks control, because it touches on wounds that have been camouflaged for centuries, exposes structures and threatens entire systems built on distorted and controlled narratives. Let's be blunt. This statue bothers traditional academia because it's material evidence that contradicts the evolutionary and historical framework we've been taught since school. With its millennia-old presence, it asserts that civilization, spirituality, and wisdom existed long before the cradles of civilization that have always been extolled in textbooks. It demonstrates that Black, African peoples already possessed symbolic, religious, cosmic, and cultural structures when humanity was supposedly still in its infancy. And if this is true, and all evidence suggests it is, then much needs to be rethought. The entire foundation of historical chronology, which extols the Roman Empire, ancient Greece, Mesopotamia, and even ancient Egypt as the starting points of civilization, becomes fragile. Worse, it reveals itself to be selective, manipulated, because what this statue suggests is that the spiritual center of humanity may have been intentionally displaced. And this, my brothers and sisters, is a direct threat to the ego of major educational institutions, to historians who have built careers repeating incomplete truths, and especially to those who profit from the neglect of the African roots of human spirituality. But the discomfort doesn't stop there. This discovery also deeply disturbs religious leaders. Yes, those who, for centuries, have reinforced the idea of a God with a European appearance, of a spirituality born in the Middle East and refined by the West. Now imagine what happens when it's discovered that the concept of a cosmic, creator, and supreme, and black God already existed thousands of years before biblical texts, councils, and dogma. This not only shakes traditional theological structures, but also exposes how far we have strayed from original spiritual truth. And then, fear arises. The fear of losing control of the masses. Because if the people realize they've been manipulated, that their roots have been erased, that their faith has been molded to serve political and colonial interests, what happens? The system collapses. Crowded churches begin to be questioned. Pastors who never spoke about Kush, Ethiopia, Sheba, and African spirituality begin to be questioned. People begin to read the Bible with new eyes. They begin to realize that the God who dwells within them doesn't need to have the traits imposed on them, and that true spiritual connection doesn't depend on an institutional structure. This is why many leaders prefer silence. They prefer to dismiss these kinds of discoveries as heresy, speculation, or worse, conspiracy theories. But what they don't know, or pretend not to know, is that the spirit of truth cannot be silenced. Once the truth begins to emerge, it doesn't stop. And this statue, with its eyes turned heavenward, its ancient symbols, and its almost living energy, is like a spiritual megaphone echoing through the centuries, crying out for recognition, demanding that humanity rediscover its roots. And of course, this truth also bothers governments, especially those that thrived on colonialism, institutional racism, and the cultural and spiritual exploitation of African peoples. Because admitting that the people who were enslaved, marginalized, and impoverished throughout history were, in fact, guardians of one of the oldest and most authentic spiritualities on the planet, is to break with the entire structure of mental and emotional domination that keeps the current power system in place. Governments fear awakening because of people who know their origins, who understand their spiritual worth, who see the image of God reflected in themselves, do not submit easily. They resist. They free themselves. And a liberated people cannot be controlled. That's why they hide, ignore, archive documents, silence research, and discredit anyone who dares to touch on these matters. And here's another point that needs to be made. There are theories, some of them strongly supported, that point to the existence of historical documents, fossils, and spiritual records that were purposefully suppressed. There are reports of researchers losing access to excavations, of museum archives that disappeared, of studies that were shelved before even being published. The question is, what are they trying to protect? Or rather, from whom? It wouldn't be hard to imagine that there are people and institutions with much to lose if this statue gains global prominence. We're not just talking about theologians and academics. We're talking about a complex global system that benefits from people's spiritual and historical ignorance. A system that fears the right question. A system that fears the power that is reborn when a people discover that their God has been erased, but not destroyed, that their faith has been disfigured, but not lost, and that their spirituality is as legitimate as any other, or perhaps more original than previously thought. This is the real reason for the silence. It's not a lack of evidence, it's an excess. And the more evidence emerges, the more effort is made to suppress it. But we're here to change that, to shine the light they tried to extinguish. And you're part of this awakening, because every time you hear, reflect, and share this truth, you're breaking the invisible chains that have been placed on you to prevent you from seeing who you truly are. And now I want to hear from you. Do you believe these truths were intentionally hidden? Have you ever felt there's more to the silence of authorities when it comes to ancestral Black spirituality? If so, comment below with the phrase, "The truth disturbs because it liberates." This will show that you're engaged in this journey and willing to see this revelation through to the end. And in the face of all that's being revealed, or rather rediscovered, a new question begins to echo within us with increasing intensity. What does this truth change in our spiritual history? Because yes, we're talking about an ancient statue, an ancestral cult, physical evidence, and a hidden narrative. But deep down, the most powerful implication of all this is spiritual. It's internal, it's individual, and also collective, because it directly impacts what many of us call faith. For a long time, our spirituality was built on a single, centralized, molded image. We were taught that God had form, voice, color, territory. We were taught to look upward, but not inward. We were taught to seek outside, but not to remember who we are. And when a discovery like this reveals the possibility, or rather the evidence, that there existed an ancestral cult to a Black god, a god venerated with respect, fear, dance, wisdom, and identity, it completely changes the place from which we begin to understand the sacred. How many times have you found yourself trying to fit into an image of spirituality that didn't reflect your origins, your color, your culture? How many times have you had to silence your ancestry to fit within a faith that seemed to not recognize you? And now, before this statue, before this ancient symbol of a God who resembles you, something begins to make sense. Something clicks. And not because someone gave you permission, but because your spirit sensed that this truth was already within you all along. What we're talking about here is not abandoning what you believe. Quite the opposite. It's about reconnecting your faith with your true spiritual identity. It's remembering that before any religious institution existed, there was already spirituality. There was already communion with the divine. There were already rituals, chants, sacred codes. And many of these originated among Black peoples, in the African forests, in ancestral communities that spoke to the heavens through drums, incense, fire, water, and words. And what does this change for modern Christianity? Everything. Because Christianity, as preached today in many parts of the world, was shaped by a European, white, imperialist vision. It was distorted to serve political, economic, and colonial interests. And in the process, many truths were diluted, replaced, or erased. Therefore, when we encounter archaeological and spiritual evidence like this, we are forced to ask the question that bothers many people, but which needs to be asked. Do we really know the true God? Could it be that the God we have been presented with is the same one our ancestors knew before colonization? Could it be that the one who liberated, healed, guided, and revealed himself in Scripture has also been reduced to a standardized, cold, distant image? Could it be that the sacred has been privatized, whitewashed, and sold in such a way as to alienate the sons and daughters who most resembled him? These questions are painful, I know, but they are also liberating, because they remind us that true faith has no owner, no flag, no color. It pulses in the spirit. And when you recognize that there can indeed be traces of the divine in your reflection, when you realize that the figure of God can indeed be black, cosmic, ancestral, then your connection with him becomes more intimate, deeper, truer. This 12,000-year-old statue is more than carved stone. It is a mirror, a reminder, a cry from the depths of time saying, "You have forgotten who I am." And this phrase to many sounds like heresy, but to those who feel it in their hearts, it is healing. Healing from erasure, healing from distortion, healing from the spiritual shame that was planted in the soul of a people so that they would not recognize their own greatness. And then, when we return to the Bible with this fresh perspective, everything takes on new life. The God who spoke to Moses through the bush, the God who led his people with a cloud and with fire, the God who breathed life into the dark clay of the earth. Perhaps he always resembled the people he first created, the people made in his image, the people who guarded their spirituality in their skin, in their dance, in their words. And suddenly, you begin to realize it was never about religion. It was always about identity. It was always about remembering. It was always about reconnecting. And this is transformative, because now you have in your hands and in your heart the chance to build a faith that is yours, a spirituality that doesn't reject you, a path with God that recognizes your roots. And this journey is not a solitary one. There are thousands of people around the world experiencing this same awakening. People who have been hurt by religion, who have walked away from faith because they felt unrepresentative, but who now, seeing truth emerge from the silence, are returning, not to physical temples, but to the inner altar, to the living presence, to the God who has always been there, but who was purposefully hidden. So, if this part of the video spoke to you deeply, if you felt something inside you awakening, comment below with the phrase, "My faith has roots." This phrase is like a spiritual seal. It's an acknowledgement that you're no longer lost, that your faith no longer needs to bow to standards that don't represent you. And tell me, what has touched you most so far? Was it the idea of a black God? Was it the possibility that your spirituality has always been legitimate? Or was it the feeling that you can finally rebuild your history with God in your own way, with your own identity? And perhaps what awakens you most at this moment is not just the surprise at the hidden history, nor the impact at the forgotten statue, but the deep echo of this question that now reaches you. What does this mean to you? Because all these revelations, these buried truths, this spiritual evidence that is being rescued, are worthless if they don't touch your real life, your walk with God, your understanding of faith, your identity as a spiritual being who carries a purpose, not just a heritage. This 12,000-year-old statue doesn't just speak of the past. It is at once a portal to the present and a mirror to the future. It asks you, without words, but with presence, do you know who you are? Do you know where your connection to the divine comes from? Have you ever stopped to question whether the image of God that was constructed within you is the true image, or if it was designed by hands that never wanted you to recognize yourself in Him? Everything you've heard so far in this video prepares you for this point. Your spiritual story has been interrupted, and it's time to resume it. Yes, it's intense, it's challenging, it's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Because if you continue to accept everything you've been taught without question, if you continue to seek God from sources that deny your own origin, you could spend a lifetime believing that your faith must come from the approval of others. And the truth is, it just needs to be yours. And true, this content is a call, a spiritual breath for you to look beyond the surface, for you to look beyond the walls of churches, beyond the white European images hanging on the walls, beyond the dogmas that distance you more than they bring you closer. Look within. Look at your ancestors. Look at your skin, your history, your roots. God dwells there too. When you understand that spirituality isn't about form, but about essence, everything changes. You no longer need to bow to an imposed narrative. You begin to build your journey with freedom, with truth, with courage. And this courage doesn't come from rebellion. It comes from awakening, because awakening is uncomfortable, but it also liberates. And this freedom isn't against God. On the contrary, it's in it that you truly encounter Him. You begin to realize that perhaps the true temple is your body, that perhaps the most sacred altar is your peaceful conscience, that perhaps the most powerful prayer is the one that springs from your heart, not from the memorized repetition of phrases that no longer have a soul, and that perhaps, just perhaps, the God who created you was never as far away as you were told. Perhaps He was always there, waiting for you to see who you are in Him, waiting for you to return, not to a doctrine, but to your essence. And the question returns, what does this mean for you? It means you need to make peace with your ancestry. It means it's time to stop asking God for permission to be who you are. It means there's a genuine spirituality pulsing within you, and perhaps it's suffocated beneath layers of fear, guilt, shame, and forgetfulness. And now is the time to peel back those layers, to take a deep breath and say, I am the temple, I am the root, I am the spirit, and God dwells within me. This is the practical application of everything discussed here. You need to reconnect. You need to stop accepting a faith that doesn't represent you. You need to look beyond. You need to study, reflect, question. Yes, question. Because faith without questioning isn't faith, it's conformity. And what we're doing here isn't destroying your faith. It's giving it back to you. It's making it alive again, and true, and yours. And you're not alone on this journey. There's a spiritual army awakening all over the world. People who have been wounded by religion, but are being healed by truth. People who were marginalized for being different, but who now understand that being different is precisely the sign of something special. People like you, people like us. So I want to ask you now, with an open heart, if you felt this video spoke to you deep down, comment below with the phrase, I am coming back to myself. This phrase is more than a comment. It's an affirmation, a spiritual vow, a new beginning, a bridge between who you were forced to be and who you were born to be. And tell me, what in this video touched you most? Which part made you see something you'd never noticed before? Your experience can help others who are also in this awakening process. If you've stayed this far, it's because something inside you was touched, and that's no coincidence. You feel that this truth can no longer be ignored, and that you're ready to delve deeper into this journey of spiritual awakening, reconnection, and identity. So, if you made it to the end of this video, leave the phrase, I'm not going back to sleep anymore, in the comments. Write this so I know you're one of those who no longer accept living in the dark, who wants more, who wants to go further. Now take advantage of this moment and leave a like. It shows YouTube that this content needs to reach more people. People like you, who are also searching for answers and who need to hear what no one else is saying. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on the notification bell, because the next episodes will reveal even deeper, more hidden, more transformative things. And I want you to join me on this journey. And since you've made it this far, don't stop now. Click on the next video that's appearing on your screen, because it's a direct continuation of this conversation and will show you connections that will blow your mind and warm your spirit. See you there.